to deepen our inquiry into the futures. And first speaker is going to be Mr. Ben Wittes, and he's editor-in-chief of Lawfare and senior fellow of governance studies at the Brookings Institution. And with Gabriella Bloom, he's just written an excellent book, which we read in the seminar, that I recommend. It's called The Future of Violence, Germs, Hackers, and Drones Confronting a New Age of Threat. That came out in 2015. It's very broad, and it's very good and highly recommended. And then after him, Dr. Andrew May, who's been here before. He's Associate Director now of the Office of Net Assessment, academic background and historian, as I recall. But he focuses now on military competition in space and on nuclear weapons, and I think he's going to focus on the latter. So thank you both for coming.
So thanks for having me. I actually want to start with 2 data points, maybe 3, that are decidedly, at least optically, not conflict related. One of them is a piece that Lisa Monaco wrote actually for Lawfare. Right after she left office, she was President Obama's counterterrorism and Homeland Security director at NSC. And she wrote a short piece for me shortly after leaving office that describes the message that she gave to her successor in the incoming administration. And it identified several areas where she was confident that there would be, that the new administration would face a crisis in the Homeland Security arena. And, you know, one of them was one you'd all predict, right, which is cyber. And another one, I think, is one that Gabby and I wrote a lot about in the book, and people felt was a little bit left, you know, sort of came out of nowhere, which is infectious disease. And Lisa's point, which I think, you know, I just commend the article to you, that she is confident to a moral certainty that this administration will not go through 4 years without having a sudden surprise infectious disease, communicable disease crisis that we'll have to treat as a Homeland Security issue. Not conflict, when I'm not talking about, you know, biological terrorism here, talking about, you know, mobility of biological pathogens in the natural course of our unusually mobile world. The second is an issue that I suspect I am the only person in this room who's obsessed with, but I confess that I am obsessed with it. And that is the cybersecurity of teenagers, which is to say online sexual extortion. So this is an issue that I started looking at in the context of researching this book with Gabby. And I've subsequently done a lot of work on at Brookings. And here's basically the problem, okay? And this doesn't sound, believe me, I'm going to connect this with what we're here to talk about. So the problem is that there are lots and lots of people in the world who exchange photographs of themselves in various states of undress and sexual activity. And a certain percentage of them then use those photographs to extort further sexual activity from one another. To give you an idea of the scale of this problem, when we finally sat down to study the scope and range of it, we found nearly 80 prosecuted cases involving probably something like 6,000 or 7,000 victims. So many of these cases are transnational. So one perp in one country is victimizing very large numbers of people, many of them children, all over the world. And I first ran into this when I ran into a case. This was a case that was so appalling to the FBI people who investigated it that their shock at it really drips off the court records. This guy's going to get out of prison this year. He's been in prison for about 6 years. Probably had something like 240 victims. when you read these cases, they read something like, virtual rapes. A lot of his victims are overseas. He was in Los Angeles. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute, that, when we think about transnational violence, we think about drone strikes, right? We think about the idea that you can sit in Nellis Air Force Base or Langley and remove from a battlefield thousands of miles away, Anwar al-Awlaki. And we have a lot of ethical discussions about the propriety of that, the legality of that, whether that's war or, assassination, right? We have lots of debates about the ethics and law of that. But I want to suggest that we're focusing the question a little bit too narrowly. And that the real issue is actually that for the first time in human history, it is possible for anybody to attack anybody else from anywhere. And that's true if you're the US military or the CIA and your target is Anwar al-Awlaki. It is also true if you're the Russian government and your target is the DNC. And those are the contexts in which we normally talk about it. But what I want to say here is that it is profoundly true as well if you're a sexual predator in Los Angeles and there are potential victims in Canada or Mexico. And that the structure of the violence that we are technologically enabling to be committed is actually, first of all, not limited to states. Secondly, not limited to the field of robotics or the field of cyber. And it is in the process of enabling all sorts of violence that we actually don't even have names for yet. So in this regard, I want to talk a little bit about the term sextortion. So this term, I didn't make it up. It's a term that prosecutors and FBI agents it's a kind of slang that they use for a type of case that they started seeing that they'd never seen before. It doesn't map onto any known statute. So if you call the Justice Department and ask them how many sextortion cases are there in the United States every year, their answer is, we have no idea. We think there are a lot. They don't know whether to categorize it as a species of violence against women, as a species of child exploitation. It's both, by the way. There are different kinds of these cases. So the actual violence that's taking place is outstripping our nomenclature. It's outstripping the legal codes that we have to describe these things to the point that we can't even count it. Now, if you're the Homeland Security Director for the National Security Council, as Lisa was, there is some seamless connection between, and I don't mean to speak for her, I'm speaking for myself, but there is a weird set of connections between the naturally occurring Zika virus that will show up here because people are mobile and viruses are mobile between people and people get on airplanes and birds fly, right? All those things. And the malevolence that people can accentuate those facts with. But I want to suggest that that is a cross-platform phenomenon, right? We talk about these as cyber issues, or as robotics issues, or as autonomy issues, or as biology issues. And I want to say that the real issue is mass empowerment of everybody all at the same time. I want to suggest that it causes three interrelated, very profound challenges to the way we organize things. So the first is this very fundamental question: how do you govern a world in which anyone can attack anyone from anywhere? who's responsible? And by the way, we think about this all the time in the cyber defense context. But the cyber defense context, you're generally dealing with powerful actors, right? This is an empowered group of people. It's the U.S. federal government. OMB is a victim, I suppose. OMB is the U.S. federal government, right? This is not an actor without power. Sony Pictures, right? Like, my heart breaks for Sony Pictures, but this is a relatively powerful actor. When you talk about the sextortion cases, you're talking about people who are, ordinary individuals. By the way, the financial harm done in routine cybersecurity, we don't talk about these identity theft cases, which are legion, but that's the cybersecurity of ordinary people. And who's responsible for that? Is it the countries that are, the source of the threats, which, by the way, we often don't know who they are? Is it the countries in which the victims live? The assumption that we've worked with for a very large number of centuries is that when something bad happens to you, that's a matter that you have your government for redress for that. And these transnational violences, and I think it is, by the way, worth thinking of them as violence. These transnational attacks really challenge that. Who's the address that you go to? The second thing is, I think there is latent in here a really profound challenge to the basic idea behind liberalism. So if you think about it as if you go back to Hobbes, right, the whole justification in Hobbes for the idea that the state has authority, the state has a right, has a legitimacy of rule, is that it can protect you. And if you really imagine a world in which attacks proliferate to the point where anyone can attack anyone from everywhere, that raises a question about whether that factual predicate of the authority and legitimacy of the state remains true. So I want to prove to you that we're already there, because people often talk to me, like, when they hear me say this, they often say, the idea that people are attacking each other across borders is theoretically true, but it's not practically true. I want to ask, how many of you have gotten an email from a Nigerian prince who's just itching to give you $10 million or $100 million if only you'll wire him $10,000, right? This is an unthinkable thing 20 years ago, that you would actually be attacked from a different continent. Now it is so routine that, now, if you were not, and what I want to suggest is that that actually is representative of a class of attacks. And the class of attacks is anything that somebody thinks that you have of value that they can take or steal or force you to do from where they are. The sextortion cases are a good example of that. Not everybody's targetable because they have money, right? So the third area of, I think, just deep challenge is that if we really believe that the power to do these attacks is migrating down to the level of the individual, and by the way, that the power of the attacks that those individuals can bring to bear is increasing dramatically and very quickly across multiple technological platforms at the same time. So that today, somebody can send you an email or a piece of malware. But tomorrow, somebody will be able to send you a Zika virus. Or better yet, a virus that's more substantial. The Zika is not the most dangerous thing in the world unless you happen to be pregnant. But there are other viruses that really are. The costs of manipulating, just as the costs of manipulating code has plummeted, the cost of manipulating biology is plummeting at a comparable rate. I don't know if any of you have ever spent time knocking around the BioBricks Foundation, but this is an incredible thing. It's a project to build interoperable, basically DNA Legos that are assemblable and behave in predictable fashions. It's an open source project, and every year they have what's called the BioBricks competition, which is see what kind of cool stuff you can bioengineer in your basement, and you bring it to Cambridge, and they show them off, and they do all kinds of cool things with these interoperable, standardized biological parts. Now, these are wonderful people, the BioBricks people. They're not, biological terrorists. It's only a matter of, so were the people who built the internet, right? It's only a matter of time before bad people figure out that this is cool too. If you believe that this is migrating, has migrated already, will continue to migrate down to the level of individuals, and that the magnitude of the capacity for attack will continue to expand at a rate that's exponential or near exponential, it follows that the relationship between the individual and the state changes. Now, again, see earlier question about which state or which authority entity you're talking about at this point. But how do you sustain an environment in which we protect things like privacy and individual autonomy in an environment in which everybody has to worry about every actor, every corporation, every university, every small business, every individual at the level of potential international threat? I think you're already seeing that in some of the stuff that has happened in Europe with respect to ISIS, right? But now, and that's largely with small explosive devices and machine guns, right? The ISIS has not been especially creative in what it's done. But the question of, as states get more and more concerned about the behavior of individuals and the capacity of those individuals expands, including expands to attack across what we think of as these very quaint ideas we have of borders. What does that do to the relationship between the individual and the state? Finally, and people talk about this routinely in the context of cyber, and to a lesser extent in the context of drones. But I want to say it's a generalizable point, that what we define as violence of a military character and what we define as violence or attacks or something less than violence, what we define as something else, right? Whether you call it crime, whether you call it espionage, whether you call it sexual assault, becomes much more of a continuum and much less of it's never been a sharp division, but it's been a division. I think what we've seen over the last few years, particularly with respect to cyber attacks, but we've had the same conversation with respect to drones. When are you operating in the world of military force, and when are you operating on the basis of some other legal authority, moral authority, sense of what instrumentality of the state is being deployed, becomes a very fuzzy set of questions. And I think that fuzziness will only grow as the range of sub-military or quasi-military violence continues to grow as well. So I will stop there, having thrown a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and we will see what sticks.
Thank you.
Hi, afternoon. My name's Andrew May. As Ed said, I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Net Assessment in OSD. And while I'm here on the government nickel and on the clock, most of what I say are really my own views rather than, views of the office or Jim Baker or anyone else there. Thanks, Ed, for inviting me back. I thought after my performance 5 years ago, I'd never see this place again. So it's just nice to be back here. I thought I'd talk a little bit about one aspect of future warfare that I've been working on and that I think is going to be kind of more prominent, and I think it's going to raise some ethics questions for the people in and around the U.S. military, which is I think the sort of revivification or revitalization of the nuclear competition and nuclear warfare more generally. I think there are a number of reasons to think that, well, first of all, I think probably nuclear weapons were never as far out of the picture as a lot of Americans wanted to believe. We've been on a kind of 20 or 25-year holiday from reality, and the rest of the world has not been, for the most part. And so I think there's been a lot going on where we just took our eye off the ball. But also I think there are a number of things in train now that are likely to put nuclear weapons back on the table in a way that's very different from how we've become accustomed to thinking about them. And most particularly, I think there are technological trends and geopolitical trends that are very likely to put nuclear weapons back on the table as militarily useful weapons. We're talking about weapons that are relatively cleaner, might be lower yield, are very likely to have specialized effects that we in this country may not fully understand as well as our adversaries, but that are weapons that are really going to be useful. And I think as a consequence of their military utility, there's a high possibility that they're going to be used, and the reaction to their use is not going to be condemnation by the world. It's going to be much more like the reaction to the first use of atomic weapons, which was, wow, those weapons solved that guy's military problem in a very efficacious way, and we would like some of those weapons. And there could be a revitalization or revivification of the kind of nuclear contest in that sense, and countries may find themselves pushed to get back into the nuclear business very, very quickly and in ways that they weren't in it before. I think there's also, in addition to those technological trends, there's this sort of more familiar prospect of nuclear proliferation, and in particular proliferation to adversaries who think about the employment of nuclear weapons in ways that are different from the ways that we like to think about the employment of nuclear weapons. My personal view is that was the differences between the United States and the Soviet Union were probably greater than we acknowledged at the time and than we want to believe. But that looking forward, I think the amount of room between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to pale in comparison to the distance when it comes to morality, when it comes to concepts of operations, when it comes to notions of targeting that are going to exist between us and adversaries like ISIS, adversaries possibly like the Chinese, adversaries like the North Koreans. These people think about the world very, very differently, even more differently from us than the Soviet Union did. So I think there's a prospect for different kinds of nuclear contingencies, contingencies in which weapons are used. And we've spent a lot of time looking at these kind of contingencies, and we've had a group of folks at IDA do a terrific study for us on, I think they came up with 19 different scenarios of nuclear use, none of which were the kind of Armageddon day after sort of scenario, but were all cases in which adversaries, not the United States, were using weapons in ways we didn't expect. One example was a jihadist attack on St. Petersburg. This is before the attack on St. Petersburg, using a dirty bomb. And the Russians decided in this scenario, this has gone on long enough. If there's going to be a clash of civilizations, we are going to take the fight to the other guys. And they hit Medina. I mean, their view is, look, terrorists can in fact be deterred. There is something they care about. They care about holy cities. This one's gone. Hit us again, and it's going to be Mecca. Now, I'm not sure the Russians would really do that. But on the other hand, I'm not sure they wouldn't. it's the kind of scenario that I think is worth thinking about, where when we got hit on 9/11, we responded with overwhelming conventional force because we have that. But there are increasingly, I think, countries that have nuclear weapons but very reduced conventional capability. And you can imagine circumstances in which, or at least I can imagine circumstances in which, those countries are hit. They feel an imperative to respond themselves, not to call on the United States to respond for them, but to respond themselves, and they lack the conventional means to deal with the problem, and turn naturally to the nuclear weapons they have to solve the problem that they feel they need to solve. We've also looked at contingencies in which adversaries are using relatively clean weapons on their own soil to forestall an invasion, and it's not really clear what the appropriate response by the United States or by any other country ought to be. The possible use of tailored output weapons to establish new escalation steps in a contest, where you could say, look, we used a very low fallout weapon in a very clean way, it had a very low yield to have some very particular effect, and that's the threshold. You know, it's now okay to use weapons of that sort, but very large yield weapons of the more familiar kind of design, those are still off the table. And so you may end up in a very different world where nuclear weapons are being used, and then the war is turning conventional again, and then nuclear weapons are used, and the war is turning conventional again. All these different kinds of circumstances that are very different from the kinds of scenarios we imagined during the Cold War period. And here I think, amidst all the many problems and nightmares and deep concerns that that kind of future presents, I think there is also opportunity is probably too strong a word, but there is some room for much better ethical work to be done. And here I think, by and large, the West gets somewhere between a D and an F on how we grappled with the ethical questions surrounding nuclear weapons during the Cold War. And we ended up with, I think, logically contorted and morally questionable positions, like it's okay to threaten civilian populations, but it is not okay to develop weapons with which you might fight and win a nuclear war without killing large numbers of civilians. And so the ethical debate, I think, by and large, during the Cold War, served more to impede and distort the development of strategy and the conversations about strategy than they did to illuminate or guide it. We have long-standing discomfort in this country with the idea of using nuclear weapons and with the idea of the discriminate use of nuclear weapons. But I believe that is where technology trends are going, that's where warfare is going, and it's not too soon for us to begin thinking about the ethical implications of those kinds of aspects and try to recast that in a way that I think could do more to enhance and further and clarify strategic debate rather than muddy it. And with that,
Thank you.
I'll wait another 5 years to be invited.
Please come back soon. Okay, we have plenty of time here for questions, 25 minutes. I wanted to ask the first one to Ben. It sounds like what you're painting then is the erosion of liberalism, liberal societies, given that security is so highly prioritized by human beings. Is that the way how do you see that developing?
So first of all, I'm not sure it's an erosion of, because the erosion of assumes that we don't develop a robust response. But I think there is a challenge, right? And, and I think the degree to which the liberal tradition, in fact, depends on borders is substantial, right? So, if you go back to Hobbes, right, there's this idea that you empower your government, or you can, in exchange for your Leviathan's decision and obligation to protect you, and that's where the source of that authority comes from. Now, there's two qualities of that protection, right? One is protection from all the other Leviathans and all those foreign actors who might want to, prey on you or your populace. But the second is protect you from disputes among your countrymen, and protect you from the sort of internal state of nature that a disordered society descends into. So one thing that your Leviathan is generally not asked to do is police all the other fish that the other Leviathans are supposed to be doing. But that's exactly what a world of many-to-many threats involves, right? So if you can sit here in Annapolis and, as I would describe, sexually assault large numbers of people all over the world, which Leviathan is responsible for that? Now, I think that there is a challenge to liberalism. Whose obligation is it to protect whom in those circumstances? And I think the answer to that question is, number one, deeply under-theorized. And number two, whether, if you're a believer in theory, which I'm largely not, but you would say as a result of the lack of theoretical innovation, has no practical answer, or if you're a believer in, evolution toward, evolutionary development sort of driving itself, you would say we have not evolved effective mechanisms in that regard. So that's one area. But the second area, which, is the one that I think you're alluding to, is how do you deal with an environment in which each state, whatever authority you give it, has to think of many more actors as potential strategic threats, and has to interact with individuals on the basis that they have some small possibility of being capable of ending the world, or ending some unacceptable amount, percentage of the world. And I think that is, one of the theoretical assumptions of the liberal tradition, is that there's a limit to how much damage an individual can do. And I don't know if that's true anymore. And quite apart from whether it's true, I don't know whether we believe it anymore, right? And so the question is, do we start behaving as though that's no longer true, either because it is no longer true, or because we're cowardly? And so I think there are at least two very substantial challenges to sort of the liberal order, both at the domestic and the international level. But I would stop short of saying erosion, because I think the question of erosion only arises as you see the response, and you see that the answer to whatever innovations we come up with to address these problems are no longer within what we would call the liberal tradition, but involves some diminution of it. And I for the record, I like the liberal tradition, and I want to, I want to see it flourish within the context of these challenges, not like let's figure out how to give up on it at this point.
Okay, thank you. I had one question then for Andrew too. Since you work on space, what do you see in the future for space weaponization?
Oh, well, I mean, my personal view is space weaponization is an inevitable trend. I mean, it's a sort of hubris of the United States that we can make some set of declarations or aspirations and expect the rest of the world will hew to our desires. But in fact, I mean, I just think the growing spread and maturity of the precision strike regime has pushed naturally other countries into the exploitation of space for all the reasons that we're in it. And therefore, even if they're not concerned about fighting us, if the Chinese are worried about fighting the Indians, they're going to have some kind of counter space capability in order to prosecute that war. The Indians will need it if they think about the Chinese, and so on and so forth. And so I think we are as certain as we can be that we'll face a world in which space has been very thoroughly weaponized, and conflict has a considerable characteristic of conflict among military powerful nations will be space, counter space, operations, reconstitution of space, and further operations, and all that sort of thing.
Inevitable.
I mean, nothing's inevitable,
Yeah.
but it's very hard for me to see a world in which that doesn't come to pass.
Okay. Adam?
My question is for Ben. You talked in this presentation mostly about the empowerment of individuals to pose threats across borders. Could you say something about the other side of this, maybe to give some optimism about the empowerment of individuals to defend themselves?
So it's a very, it's actually a substantial portion of the book is about sort of distributed defense so look, offense always gets ahead of defense in initial technological developments, right? And I think it is, first of all, reasonable to hypothesize, and we have certainly seen the development of the same development of highly empowered individuals functioning in a defensive capacity, often in networks and groups that we've seen on the offensive side. And so it is reasonable to assume that that is part of the picture of the answer, and some of it is developing organically. Some of it is not developing organically. It needs to be incentivized. And it needs to be thought through how you would want to incentivize it. It is also the case, I think, that those networks of individuals who are going to be doing that, to be really effective, have to be doing it subconsciously. So let me give you an example of that. If I say to you, how many of you want to participate in a neighborhood watch, right? The answer is I'll get a few, hands raised, and among the people who raise their hands, even fewer of them will actually show up to the neighborhood watch meeting. And among the ones who show up to the neighborhood watch meeting, the ones who are useless will outnumber the ones who are, right? So, but if I say to you, if I can create if I can get your insurance companies to raise your homeowner's insurance rates if you don't install decent locks on your door, you will all do it. And the environment of the neighborhood in question will be safer. And you will not do it because you're self-consciously participating in some system of distributed defense. You'll do it because your homeowner's insurance company told you you need to have a better lock on your door. And so I think the challenge is not a challenge, your point is a very profound one, and we are ultimately talking about incentivizing mass behavior. But the challenge is not a challenge of getting large numbers of people interested in doing this and sort of going to school to study cyber defense or biodefense, though we should be doing all those things. The challenge is figuring out what safer environments against this sort of these sorts of threats look like, and how to engage, how to incentivize the largest number of people to pick the lowest hanging fruit the highest percentage of the time. And that's to a large extent, that's a set of behavioral economics questions.
Jessica.
Just a question for Ben. I was just thinking about your comment about the relationship between the individual and the state changing, and you're focusing very much on the question about sort of threats to state legitimacy posed by the fact that individuals can cause extreme harm to each other across borders. I wonder if you could say something about the fact that individuals are also much more vulnerable to their own states, because states have these immense powers as well to, through this technology, to inflict significant harm on their own citizens.
Right, so this is an excellent point, and let's deal with it at a non-theoretical level, but at the level of like the area where this set of questions plays out on a day-to-day basis, which is signals intelligence, and specifically when signals intelligence capabilities, as they increasingly do, involve interactions with tech companies that you compel to produce signal. So this is, has been a consistent source of public debate since the last, not the last administration, the Bush administration's so-called warrantless wiretapping program was revealed, but it was all through the Obama administration. There was a debate over FISA 702, and this was a central issue in the Snowden revelations, right? And you say, well, there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, in which US signals intelligence acquisition was the least controversial component of the intelligence community. I mean, we yacked at each other about, about covert actions from the CIA, but the idea that, we should be collecting overseas, signal, electronic collection, technical collection overseas was just not a controversial proposition. And all of a sudden, over the last 10, 15 years, it has become a source of constant anxiety between tech companies, the government, civil libertarians, and individual users of technology, right? So that when Jim Comey says, I've got a problem on the encryption side, 100 million Apple users care, right? And so I think it's worth asking the question, A, why is that? And the answer is both the point that I made and your response to it. Number one, that lots and lots of people have the ability to use these incredibly powerful technologies through these gigantic intermediary companies. And by the way, the government can't do its job without the cooperation of these intermediary companies. And so in order to fulfill its basic functions, we have to have these laws that compel the cooperation of the companies. The government is lost if Google does not cooperate with its production requests. But similarly, to acquire signal, to be able to acquire signal from ISIS, the government has to have the kind of liaison relationships with Google that enable, or Apple, that enable it also to acquire your signal. And that means that all kinds of users feel like their relationship with government has changed or their privacy has been threatened. So I think this is a good example, both your side of it and my side of it are examples, they're flip sides of the same coin, which is that the more and more people have access to these technologies, have the ability to do good and bad activity on them, and the more those activities are interlaced through these intermediaries in a fashion that the government simply has to have access to in order to fulfill its own function, the more stress we put on that relationship between the government and the individual. And the fact that we are going to have a giant racking debate over reauthorization of FISA 702 this year is a reflection of the fact that we haven't really answered those questions in any way that commands a consensus, the way it used to be a consensus that signals intelligence acquisition against overseas targets was just something the government gets to do.
Henrik, who's just come in from Norway.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a question to Andrew May. While you were speaking, I looked up the website of Global Zero, which is arguably the foremost realist-oriented anti-nuclear NGO, and founded by people like William Perry, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz. And that represents a different view from yours, namely that, yes, we are in an age now where limited nuclear war is possible, and for that very reason, ethically speaking, more than ever, do we need to work to eliminate nuclear weapons. and that there are realistic ways of doing that. So how would you, from your point of view, where you said that the likelihood is rather that they'll spread and will be used, how do you evaluate such efforts?
Thank you. I didn't talk about disarmament in my comments, although that was obviously a major part of the ethics discussion and the morality discussion during the Cold War, largely because I think it's a laudable but entirely impractical goal. I have a lot of respect for the folks you mentioned, and there's no doubting their appreciation of the world and how things work. And so I don't want to say that they're dreaming or anything like that, but for myself, I just don't see any way ahead. I found personally Schelling's response to the initial article much more persuasive. And I also think that the attractions of nuclear weapons, apart from the practicality of disarmament, which I think are insuperable, I think that the attraction of nuclear weapons is just going to be overwhelming, particularly for countries that don't have the kind of conventional superiority or tremendous conventional power that the United States enjoys. And we're in a very fortunate position that we work very hard to attain. But you look at a country like France, for example, and it's just not realistic to think they're going to be able to find conventional substitutes for the kind of military capability that nuclear weapons provide.
David?
This is really a follow-on to Andrew from the last question. I mean, I thought that the Cold War ethics argument was more coherent than the way that you presented it. I mean, you presented it as kind of a perverse idea that you could target large numbers of civilians, but not really, but have a taboo about smaller scale uses of nuclear weapons. It seems to me that it all flowed from the same principle, namely they should never be used, any of them. And that the reason that you could target large number of civilians was that, colossally risky, of course, but that mutual assured destruction was the only way we could think of to make sure that they weren't used, and that the reason for not trying to work on smaller scale uses of them was that a nuclear taboo was necessary in order to avoid, so to speak, normalizing it up. Now, I understand the argument that you made that in the future we can't count on other actors reasoning that way or forbearing from them. But it still seems to me that there's a core to the argument that's right, namely that any move on our part to suggest that the taboo should disappear, any idea that fighting with nuclear weapons is even on the table for us runs that risk of a new normal. The new normal that you talked about was, well, we use them in these very limited number of contexts where they're effective and relatively clean. But I just think that the reasoning in your original Cold War principle is that once you change the new normal, then you also change the possibility of using of the new abnormal, and that the next thing is the thermonuclear weapons. And I'm wondering how you respond to that.
Well, actually, it was that very distinction between it's okay to use them as a deterrent and not okay to ever contemplate using them that I thought was the most logically bankrupt and worrisome part of their argument. So looking at the past first of all, I as you probably guessed from my comment, I'm not a big adherent to MAD, and I'm very skeptical that we can chalk up the lack of nuclear use during the Cold War to MAD, per se. But secondarily, my personal view is it's very difficult, and I would say impossible to, unprofitable, to try to think about how we're going to have a secure deterrent, a credible deterrent, if we're simultaneously saying, oh, but by the way, we'll never use these weapons, right? They're just for having and for threatening. And it leads, first of all, obviously, I think, the credibility of use and our ability to convince our adversaries, potential adversaries, and our allies that yes, we can use these weapons, we have a plan for using these weapons, and we will use these weapons if we are forced to use them, is the bedrock of both deterring our adversaries and reassuring our allies. And if we begin to walk away from that, we don't strengthen our deterrent, but we erode it. But then there's the only other point I'll make to that is I think the other thing that the sort of position taken about it's okay for deterrence but not for use is that it promotes, I think, a false view that deterrence is a free side effect of having nuclear weapons. It's a sort of instant benefit. Whereas, in fact, I think my own view of why one of the reasons Cold War deterrence worked was that while we had the weapons, we were also demonstrating to the Soviet Union on a routine basis that we had the operational competence and the will to do the kinds of things that scared the daylights out of them. And we conducted a lot of, as you know better than I do, we conducted a lot of exercises, we did a lot of demonstrations, we did things specifically so they would see what we could do. And that kind of more operational, street fighter, gritty level of deterrence, I think, is a very important level and tends to get missed when people talk about just making threats in that more abstract.
Andrew, on this point?
Andy Corbett, I'm King's College London, but I've just spent 4 years in NATO writing NATO nuclear policy. And I think we hear on fire all over Europe after this discussion again. Well, the issue I have is you use the term for military effect. And I think with what you said, is the only problem I have there is I think nuclear weapons in the NATO parlance are there purely for deterrence, as you say, and we would never ever use them. So therefore, how deterrent purpose do they have? And I would say the advance we've made over the last sort of 4 or 5 years is this idea that we've gone away from different deterrents and we would never use them to they're for deterrence and they have a political effect for which we could use them. But we would never contemplate using them for military effect. There's no point in blowing up a bridge with a nuclear weapon because you can do it conventionally. There are very, very few targets that you would need to use a nuclear weapon on that you couldn't take with conventional PGM. So therefore, that brings you back to what are the nuclear weapons for? And I would suggest that they are for political effect. They're for scaring the living daylights out of the other guy to prove to him that you are prepared to do this. And ultimately, always comes back to the escalation. And I think we'll have to agree to differ on whether or not that's controllable. And that would always end up threatening populations. It's all very well saying, well, I only nuked a submarine which is miles away from anything, but that will escalate in certainly European parlance. And you would end up trading Chicago for Leningrad or whatever it is. So I don't think I've really got a point or a question on it. My point is that if the USA starts talking about using nuclear weapons for military effect, that is going to cause carnage in the corridors of the
Well, first let me clarify my comment that I was really speaking about other countries being attracted to the use of nuclear weapons for military effect, specifically those countries that can't service all targets with conventional capabilities. But I'll also say there is a very big and very important difference between there are no targets for which we would need to use nuclear weapons, and there are almost no targets for which we need to use nuclear weapons. And there are, in fact, targets for which a nuclear weapon is the best, most appropriate, and most militarily efficacious tool. And we'd be derelict in our responsibilities if we didn't think about weapons that hit those targets and destroy them.
General Miller?
Mr. Wittes, you talked about kind of a distributed approach to defending against the many-to-many threat, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the enhanced Leviathan model that the Chinese are using, and how much of that, if any, you see as a solution in the future.
So, I would say my enthusiasm for the enhanced Leviathan is altogether under control for reasons that, first of all, I think the outcome tends to be very brittle. And it works really, really well until it ceases to work at all, right? And I think one group of people that actually seems to understand that is the Communist Party of China, which is why they're running scared all the time, of things as trivial as Falun Gong, right? And this is, I think, not the mark of a stable security regime. Look, there are areas where the state has to be stronger than it is, or some state has to be stronger than it is. And I think there are areas, for example, in some of the areas that I've talked about, where we simply have to do a better job than we do of international law enforcement cooperation. And the idea, so I don't know how many of you follow this issue, but there is a rip-roaring, ongoing set of disputes now involving cross-border transfers of data that arose because of Microsoft's storing a bunch of data in Ireland, but it has huge implications for all sorts of international investigations and litigations. We don't have an answer to that question, right? Now, one way or another, the answer to that question is going to empower or disable a whole lot of states in the conduct of investigations that we all want to happen, right? So in that sense, lots of Leviathans working together have to have tools of cooperation to work together and have to have effective tools within, but they have to be democratic, and they have to be tools that are accountable. They have to be tools that are, that we can explain why they are legitimate exercises of sovereign power rather than simply, expressions of power, right? And I sort of believe that as a normative matter, but I also think as an empirical matter, it's very hard to find an example of the state that responded to a challenge like this by simply doubling down on state power and lived to tell the tale after X number of years. And we can argue about how long X is, but in the broad scheme of time, it's not long. And I think China's living on borrowed time.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So although I don't know about you guys, but I'm feeling very vulnerable at this point. So I think a break would be nice. But thank you both for coming. And I highly recommend Ben's book, The Future of Violence. Excellent. And Andrew, please come back soon. And we'll take a 15-minute break, come back at 5 after the hour, and let's please give them a hand.